Guys, welcome to the podcast. This is going to be kind of a fun little series that we're going to do on Coues Deer hunting, and I'm going to go back through the 600 and some episodes and find some of the best Coues Deer episodes that we've done here. And hope you guys enjoy it. We've got Coues Deer hunts going all over central and southern Arizona right now, and we've got the mid-December hunts coming up here quick, and the OTC December and January archery hunts. So I figured you guys had Coues on the brain. I'm going to try and pull some of the best stuff over the last 4 years. So guys, before we get to that episode, I want to thank you for your avid support of this podcast. You guys show loyalty to this podcast, and it's amazing. I'm very appreciative of that. If you guys have any questions at all or comments, you can reach me at jscottoutdoors@gmail.com. You can also send me a direct message on Instagram at jscottoutdoors. Love to hear from you guys. Thanks for all of the support. And I also hear from my sponsors virtually every day about how much support you guys give them. So I want to thank you guys for that. I want to thank the sponsors of the podcast. I want to thank GoHunt.com. And right now, there's Black Friday sales going on at GoHunt.com. Go check it out. There's anywhere from 25 to 50% discounts. Some really cool stuff out there. Plus, you get a chance to win a free elk hunt. So go check it out. I also want to thank my friend Cody Nelson. He's the optics manager there at GoHunt.com. If you guys have any optical needs at all, if you have any questions in regard to glassing, or if you're looking to purchase any optics, whether it be binos, tripods, spotting scopes, rifle scopes, anything to do with glassing, give Cody a call, 702-847-8747. That's extension 2. You can also send him an email directly at optics@gohunt.com. I want to thank them for their sponsorship. Also want to remind you guys that you can check out the Go Hunt Insider, get a little bit of a jump start on application season. Go to gohunt.com/jscott. That's going to get you a $50 Go Hunt Gear Shop gift card. I want to thank Coues Ultralight Hunting. Coues gear is the gear that I wear on all of my hunts. You can go on my Instagram page routinely throughout the week. I'm answering questions. A lot of those questions pertain to Coues gear. Coues gear, if you want to know more about it, you can also go to Coues, that's KUIU.com. And Coues Ultralight Hunting Gear, I've been wearing it since 2010, and if you guys haven't tried it, you need to. It's awesome stuff. I also have some great sales going on right now. I also want to thank phonescope.com. If you use the jscott19 promo code, you're going to get a 10% discount, and onxmaps.com. Right now, a special for a few more days, if you use the Thanks30, so go to onxmaps.com, use the Thanks30. You're actually going to get a 30% discount. Normally here at the J Scott Outdoors podcast, you get a 20% discount for using JScott19. But if you want 30% discount, go to onxmaps.com, Thanks30. And I want to thank them for their sponsorship. Guys, let's get right to this series on Coues Deer hunting. And again, thanks for all your support. Welcome to the J Scott Outdoors podcast. Today we're fortunate to have a Coues Deer killer himself on the end of the line, Jake Lindsey. Jake, how you doing?
Good, Jay. How are you?
Good. I remember having you on the last time on the podcast, and we got a lot of good feedback from the podcast I did with you. And for the listeners out there that didn't hear that podcast, I'd highly recommend go back and listen to it. A little background on Jake. I believe you're a firefighter. You're a U of A Wildcat fan, which that led us to a whole nother discussion on the last podcast. But one thing you're really known for is you and your buddies seem to be around big Coues deer, and you've done really well being able to dredge out some of those big bucks. And so I want to get you on the podcast here with the Arizona deer and sheep applications. The draw just went through, and everybody's fired up about Coues deer, and I thought I could pick your brain to talk a little Coues deer. No better person to talk to you than yourself. But first and foremost, how do you think your Cats are going to do this year in football?
In which game?
Well, I think you're kind of like me. The only game that matters is the ASU U of A game, and I know both programs are probably seems like both programs are a little bit in disarray. Um,
Yeah.
but it's one of those things. It doesn't matter throughout the year how good each team is. When that game comes, you throw it all away because it's just a wild card. I mean, that's one thing
Mhm.
I've loved about for 35 or however 40 years almost, that game is just a wild card game.
Yeah, it's pretty unpredictable. I took my boys to the spring football game there at the U of A, and it was fun. I will say that I'm a little worried. There was a few bright spots. We have a pretty young quarterback that has some pretty good potential and everything like that, but I'm pretty nervous. It might be another one of those years. I hate to say it, but it might be Rich Rodriguez's last year.
Yeah, it's one of those things. These coaches are very, very good. All across college football. Obviously, there's better coaches than others, but Rich Rod is a really, really good coach, and you know, everything always funnels up to the coach, and it's always the coach's fault. But I have to say, I mean, there's been circumstances and such that some of these head coaches, it's not really their fault.
No, I mean, I don't know if it's the nature of the beast. You sign a contract and become the coach. Everything falls on your shoulders, regardless of how your players perform. So I don't know how you change that. It's all about winning, and it's all about making that money for the university. And if you can't produce W's, then it doesn't matter in the end, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know I'll be looking forward to the game in November, and of course, everybody knows which side I'll be on. But it's always nice to have that rivalry, and I get a lot of Instagram comments and people around that time razzing me, and certainly I'm one to dish it out, but that comes back twofold when ASU gets stomped. I usually get plowed pretty good with messages and people piling on, which rightfully so. Um, so let's talk about some Coues deer. The last time we talked, you guys had you and your buddies, you had killed some big giant deer, and the draw just came out. And did you have any points going in? I believe you killed the buck last year, so you had limited points, and you probably just drew another Coues deer tag, the general season type tag, huh?
Yeah, I did. I had well, I had a couple of points going in, just my hunter's education point and my loyalty point, which everybody can get if you've put in for, I believe it's 5 consecutive years for a
Yeah.
loyalty point, and then hunter's education, you just got to take the course. So I technically just went in with 2 points this year, and I did. I drew another general season
Yeah.
tag.
One question I would have for you, Jake, and I know we talked a little bit about it on the last episode. I mean, do you swing for the fences and do you go for that late December tag as your first choice for Coues deer and then back it up with, say, an October tag? Or because of the amount of scouting and stuff, you guys have done very, very well early season. Do you just go for your best units and go for those first, those October hunts where you can get first crack at those bucks?
Jay, it depends. For me, anyway, it kind of depends on if I have a buck already picked out from the year before that I think might have the potential to turn into something really good, or if I feel I don't have much to work with, then I may gamble and try to put in for a December hunt as a first choice. But you know, um, my hunting partner Mark and I, we've been pretty fortunate. We've been able to find some pretty good bucks over the past several years, and keeping tabs on them. That the October hunt is just a hard one to pass up, even if we don't have one necessarily nailed down or for sure in our back pocket before the season starts. We kind of cross our fingers and hope that before the season starts, when we get all of our intel in, that we might have something to go with.
For sure. Don't you think, I mean, the October hunts have gotten a lot of press, so to speak. We've talked about it. I mean, there's other publications and what have you talk about if you have bucks spotted, you can, do really well on that October hunt. But taking a step back and the general hunter, the just, maybe the weekend guy that, this is his big hunt of the year, but just doesn't have a lot of time to scout, or maybe it's not a priority. Would you agree that actually those October hunts can be very, very difficult if you just kind of go in not having scouted, not having a buck picked out? I'm just curious your thoughts of, do you see maybe that December 1st through the 10th, that third Coues Deer season, not the quote unquote rut hunt, but maybe the December 1st through the 10th, I believe, is the time frame coming up where the weather is cooler. Maybe they're going to see more deer. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. I got a little bit of a pet peeve, and it's when people call that third whitetail hunt a December hunt, and there needs to be some distinction with that third whitetail hunt, that December 1st through the 10th Coues Deer tag. Number one, that is not a December hunt. It just so happens that it falls on December 1st through the 10th this year. The majority of the time that hunt starts the day after Thanksgiving, and I guess the biggest difference between the two would be the true December hunt, which generally starts the middle of December and goes through the 31st. You do start getting into that pre-rut activity, and the weather, of course, is a little bit better. It's at least 2 weeks long. The third general hunt, which I usually call it the Thanksgiving hunt, because it usually starts the day after Thanksgiving. I believe, I personally think the advantage to that hunt is you have more days to work with than the first two Coues Deer hunts. The first two Coues Deer hunts are only 7 days apiece. That late November, or like you said in this case, that December 1st through the 10th hunt is a 10-day hunt. So you've got a few more days to work with. For somebody, I feel like, that doesn't have a lot of time to work with, that late November hunt, that third general Coues Deer hunt, might be your best option, because at least you've got 2 weekends to work with. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, I mean, so from a time frame standpoint, having twice the amount of time, having 2 weekends, you feel like, for the general hunter that maybe doesn't have the time to spend, not only is it temperature-wise maybe a little bit, more pleasant, both from a human side of it, not getting as hot and being able to hike when it's cooler, but from a deer movement and such, do you feel like deer movement year in and year out, obviously we have moon phases and different things that weigh into that, but do you feel like deer movement on those October hunts is less or more than, say, that Thanksgiving hunt? Curious your thoughts on that.
I think it's no question it's less. And just to, I guess, piggyback on what you said a little bit ago, that's why I would say the October hunt, I would agree with you, is a more difficult hunt. If you don't have the time to preseason scout a specific buck, or a couple of bucks that might be hanging out in a certain area, that October hunt can really kick your butt. It really can. So they're definitely moving a lot less than they would be later on in the season, end of November into December and everything else.
One thing I would ask, talking about movement, do you think it's strictly a temperature standpoint, meaning October is, say 10, 15 degrees warmer, maybe say than that Thanksgiving hunt? I mean, do you strictly think it's a temperature issue there as far as movement?
I think it is, because you'll probably find, what I found anyway, is deer do the same thing in the later springtime as well. They're moving back into their summer ranges, or I should say that core area where they generally spend most of their lives gets much smaller than it was maybe in January during the rut when they're moving around a lot more. And so I think these deer, especially Coues deer, they have such a small home range that for 9 months, 10 months out of the year, it's really small. So October, I would definitely say they're not moving. As far as when these hunting seasons begin, for rifle anyway, October, they're just not moving around very much. And then as you get closer into later November, they'll move around a lot more. I think it's probably a little bit pre-rut related. The younger bucks might be traveling a little bit more than the bigger bucks as you get closer into the middle of December and stuff. But eventually, or I should say ultimately in the end, these bucks just aren't moving around very much, largely because of the temperature is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, for sure. You know, you take that October hunt, one real benefit that I see in that is the fact that not many people have been in the field. Those deer are fresh. You could potentially find bucks or groups of bucks that are out on open hillsides feeding. Whereas when you get to some of the, second, third seasons, some of those quote unquote gimme bucks, and I'm generally talking about bucks that, the general guy that just wants to go Coues deer hunting every year and just shoot a buck. The one thing about October is maybe there's a chance you get back in some of those basins and those deer are not as pushed around. So I can see positives and negatives of both hunts. It seems like guys, like yourself, always tend to pick those, seasons where you get first crack at them. But I think most of that's because you want to have a buck scouted out in the summer and know exactly where you want to be, and you're basically sitting on one hill for the entire hunt, correct?
Well, sure. And Jay, there's several factors that go into where I'm at, come opening morning. And, when you consider certain mountain ranges, throughout the Southwest, most of our Coues deer habitat, we get really good rains, especially in the summer and everything like that. And when you get up in those mountains, there's plenty of springs and pools of water that these whitetail have to work with. So they're spread out so much, and our whitetail population is doing so well that you don't have to necessarily worry about rain for the most part. But you can find little pockets where they tend to be a little bit more dry than normal. And I think that might be feed related when it comes to what these animals tend to, why they spend most of their time there. So for me personally, I might not be hunting the same place year after year, and it could be related to these little pockets that might not have got as much rain as the year before. I may have a tendency to stay away from that. I don't necessarily think those bucks leave those areas, but it could reflect on his antler growth that year as well. So I guess ultimately what I'm trying to say is I hunt where I can find the biggest buck, and if I found one, then that's where I'm going to spend the majority of my time. I'm not going to hunt anywhere else, hoping, I guess anyway, during that October hunt, hoping that a big buck is just going to appear. For the most part, where I'm at opening morning is where I feel like I have the best chance of killing the biggest buck.
Okay, let's go down a little bunny trail here on what you're saying. So you're saying that most of the time when you go out Coues deer hunting, really no matter what season it is, you are going to be in an area that you have seen a big buck, you know that he's in the area, and so tactically you are going to really work that country over until either A, you find the buck and he's got a broken antler, or you're glassing off a rock and you find the buck and somebody else shoots him, or you blow the buck out or what have you, like it. And I think it's important to kind of grind this in, is like the reason you guys have been successful. Well, one of the reasons is the fact that you guys are hunting in an area where you have either seen a big buck or that there's a big buck there, and then you concentrate your efforts in that spot, correct?
Exactly. And that doesn't necessarily mean that for anybody that wants to follow me around in my truck in the field, that doesn't mean that I found a big buck. Okay?
Right.
It just means that I, my time is limited, so I don't feel like if I don't feel like I'm in the right area, I'm not going to waste my time. And so if I feel like there's a specific buck that I need to put my eyes on, that's where I'm going to be. And if he happens to be, maybe because of the year before, I felt like he had a whole lot of potential, then that's exactly where I'm going to be opening morning. There's nowhere else, I guess, in my mind. Once again, I'm just not going to waste my time with.
Have you had the unfortunate circumstance of finding a big giant buck in an area that you're like, oh my goodness, why in the world do you have to be right here? Like everybody in the world is around, and here you are dancing around out on the hillsides. Have you ever been sitting there glassing going, bed down? Would you just like that? I think for guys like yourself, that spend a lot of time on state land hunting big deer, I'm sure you've found big deer in places that you wish you wouldn't have found them there.
Jay, for sure. Jay, Randy Epperson, and he's got a little saying of "There's no secrets in the woods," and there's so much truth to that. I found an exact scenario. I found a really big buck down in a southern Arizona unit that just gets pounded by deer hunters. Well, I'll just say what it is. Down in 36A, and this was in August that I glassed this deer up, and he couldn't have been in a more obvious place. And I saw this deer several times, and I actually had an October tag for that same hunt that same year. I found that deer about a mile away from where I saw him when he was in velvet the evening before the first day of the hunt, and I thought that I had this deer basically in the back of my truck. And ultimately, in the end, I never killed that deer. I never even saw him during the hunt. I spent the first 5 days of the hunt looking for him, and I think that was largely due to the amount of people that just started showing up that night and even the next morning. There's these deer just they disappear when they start getting a lot of pressure. I think that deer was still there, close by. He just was not moving very much for me. So there's nothing you can do about it sometimes. You just continue to hunt those places where the big deer might be, whether that's in the deep, dark canyons or whether that's right off the highway. That's just where you have to hunt him. You got to hope that he pokes his head out one morning.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to your first, second, third season as well, and where you hunt for 5 days on the October hunt and people are all around and that buck's just going to lay up in the brush and never even gets up. Your gut tells you that buck was right there the whole time. Maybe you get that Thanksgiving hunt that you call it, and maybe you get 2 weekends. Maybe having twice as much time gives you a chance to just sit there, and finally that buck makes a mistake. But wouldn't you agree that, there have been some giants in the state of Arizona killed, literally in places that you would just cringe and think, you got to be kidding me. How has that buck managed to live there as long as he has?
Yeah, and that's a hard one to wrap my head around. Everybody these days have a set of 15 power binoculars, and everybody's got a tripod. And God, I think if there was a change in technology over the past God, I don't know how many years that has sort of revolutionized hunting in general. It's been trail cameras, and so how does a buck survive that long? My only explanation is there's not very many people putting cameras up next to the highway. That's the only explanation I have. And when you got such a small home range of these really big bucks, that's just how they tend to survive. So, yeah, I mean, it's a tough one to explain or understand. I personally don't spend a lot of time next to the highway, so it's nothing. So I'm unlucky in that sense that most of the time when we're killing the bucks that we're killing, it's a little bit more of a pack out than that.
For sure. Let's take a step back here, and for some of the listeners out there that maybe I get a lot of people messaging me saying, it's their first Coues Deer hunt, they're excited about drawing, and regardless of what season they drew, let's just say, first, second, third, even the December, pre-rut hunt. What are some general things of a guy like yourself that, have killed a lot of deer, and maybe break this down, maybe talk about, looking for big deer, but maybe just talk to the people that have drawn their Coues Deer tag this year for the first time. What are things that you would do in giving them advice for going on their first Coues Deer hunt, types of country to look at, what should they be doing, etc.?
I think it starts from, you got to get in your truck and you got to go drive into your unit. That plays a big factor in the whole thing. There used to be a time, Jay, when that's all people did. That's the only way you could scout, was you hopped in your truck and you drove there and you figured the roads and the terrain out yourself. And then you start referencing topographical maps, and then you can start seeing vantage points and natural travel routes and north-facing slopes where deer generally tend to hang out, and things like that. But seeing it firsthand, there's no replacement for that. And then beyond getting in your truck and beating your truck up and putting all the miles on it, you got to get out of your truck and you got to hike a little bit. That's the main thing. There's a big. It's so easy to get information now online that I think we've sort of seen a little bit of a lazy hunting culture when it comes to getting information on their own. They just kind of
Are you telling me that there's people that draw Coues Deer hunts, and are you telling me, Jake, that there's people that draw these tags and the first day of their hunt is the first day they actually went to the unit? Are you telling me that happens?
Never. Jay, I used to work for PSE here in Tucson, the compound bow manufacturer, and it would always drive me crazy because we'd have guys coming in a week before the archery bull season would start and try to get bows set up. So, no, I mean, let's just face it. Not everybody loves it the way you and I do, and maybe that's a good thing. It keeps a little bit more people out of the field, and we can enjoy the solitude a little bit more. But when it comes down to it, the other thing you got to consider is not a lot of people are out there willing to hold out for bucks that we generally want to come home with.
Thank goodness, right? Thank goodness for those
people.
Yeah.
If you're just an average Coues Deer hunter and this is your first time drawing a tag, just hop in your truck and drive to your unit and get to know it, familiarize yourself with the road. Sometimes you'll show up and some roads might be closed off. So familiarize yourself with the roads. Buy a topo map. These days you've got them on your smartphone. So get one on your smartphone and start picking the land apart and the terrain apart. And you can find vantage points where you can get up there with your binoculars and you
Let's talk about that, Jake. Let's talk about that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say vantage points, what are you looking for, and what advice can you give people out there that are listening? So they're getting in their truck, they're driving, like visually, what are you looking for when you say vantage point?
I'm looking at anything that, based on the terrain and the topography, based on all of that, I can see the most country possible. and that's generally the first vantage point that if I'm stepping into the unit for the first time, that's the first vantage point that I'm going to go to, because as I get up there and I see the most terrain as possible, I might see a different point that I definitely want to get to. So, you want to see as much country as possible. When you get up there, you might realize it's not as good as you thought, but you might see that next point that puts you exactly where you think you want to be to scout during the summer or opening day of your deer hunt or whatever. I do tend to I like to find stuff where I can glass into some north-facing slopes or some northwest-facing slopes that might get a little bit more, or northeast. Anywhere you can get the shade is where these deer are generally going to hang out. So I'm not going to necessarily focus on a vantage point that's only going to give me a south-facing slope.
Okay, that leads me into another series of questions. We touched on it on the podcast before, but I want to say, kind of, when I first started Coues Deer hunting, I did kind of the opposite. I went and found vantage points, but I went where I could see the best, which typically is the open south-facing slope. And you tend to pick up more deer on those south-facing slopes when you're a beginner, when you're don't have a trained eye to look into the shadows and spend a lot of time looking into those north-facing thicker hillsides. Would you agree that a lot of people go on their Coues Deer hunts and maybe even hunt for a long time, never really focusing where the majority of the deer are? I wish you could speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question you can see more deer on a south-facing slope than you can a north-facing slope. If you're going to do that, you better start really early in the morning or really late in the evening. The deer aren't going to hang out there for very long, I guess is what I'm saying. You can't expect, we are no different than the deer are, so you can't expect us to sit out in the middle of the sun for too long without just getting too hot. So if you're a beginner and you want to see a lot of country and you want to see some deer for sure, and maybe that's what you need to train that eye to find those Coues deer. That might be the best thing that you can do. Sometimes looking into those north-facing slopes or where it's really thick with a lot of vegetation can be a little monotonous and time-consuming because you're trying to pick apart pieces of deer, as opposed to on a big open south-facing slope, you can generally see that entire deer, and your eyes can get a little bit better or a little bit more trained for it.
Yeah, I think I think you hit it really good there. You can train your eye to see the full body shape of a deer on a south-facing slope, and typically I see quite a few does, quite a few fawns, some small bucks. But when I'm looking for a big point, I'm trying to look where I can see open slopes and then just barely make a pivot and see into a bunch of thick, north-facing slopes. And I want to come back to the north-facing slopes here in a minute, but you also said something where if speaking to the people out there that are just kind of getting their feet wet Coues deer hunting, you're going to be looking for vantage points and places where you can get up and see a lot of country. So from what I hear you saying is you're taking kind of a macro approach, a big approach, spreading a big net out and trying to, first day glassing in your unit, just kind of get an overall sense, overall view. And then maybe from there you identify 4 or 5 other ridges or points or high knobs or what have you, or maybe even low knobs, but it might look into particular country. How do you itemize, or how do you characterize or categorize, oh, I want to go on that knob, oh, I need to go on that knob? Like, what are you looking for once you've gotten your macro view?
Well, sometimes it's difficult, especially if you don't have something like a topographical map for reference. I can sit up on a knob and look a certain direction, and see another knob and feel like I want to get over there and check it out. Well, having a topographical map to tell me what's exactly on the other side of that second knob might be the deal breaker as far as me making that
You mean like a
move or
main
not.
road or a piece of private property and a bunch of disturbance over there? Is that is that what you mean?
Well, it could be anything exactly, Jay. It might be a sheer drop off cliff that I know, for a good 200 or 300 yards, there's not going to be any deer over there. So it may be something that just isn't practical. Now, there could be a giant living over there, and maybe I would have never known it. And somebody like yourself knew about that little draw or that little canyon, and I just never went. But generally, I'm just trying to base whether I make my next move or not off of most of the time this map that I've got in my hand and what the terrain is telling me, where in my case I'm looking for mature bucks, and I feel like I got an idea where these mature bucks are living. But if you're just looking for any bucks in general, Jay, you can find those, it seems like, in any terrain on any hillside anymore with how well our Coues deer population is doing.
Yeah, for sure. You talked about, you're looking for mature bucks, and you said you had a pretty good understanding of where the mature bucks are. I would ask you, in all of your years of expertise, if you could summarize where the most mature bucks are, where are they?
It's where you don't want to go. I don't know if there's any other way to explain it. And that could, some people might interpret that as the really far backpack hunts that nobody wants to go to, and some might interpret that as the little tiny cut below the highway. It's where people don't want to go. It's where people overlook. But I would say in general, these big bucks are big because they didn't get the pressure that all of your small bucks living on the south-facing slopes or anywhere remotely close to a road where anybody on a quad or a side-by-side can get to. So I would venture to say that the majority of your big bucks that you're going to look for, it's going to take some effort and probably more physical effort than it is mental effort, glassing for a buck underneath the highway.
So from what I hear you saying, if you can get away from roads, if you can get to where you can look into country that is not easy to get to, and if you can get good at glassing north-facing slopes, you have a much better chance to finding more mature deer.
I would agree.
Okay. From a terrain standpoint, I know you found big bucks in, Ocotillo Desert Flats to, yellow grass, oak, mesquite basins to, thick, nasty all the way up into the pines. For general people out there just trying to go on a Coues deer hunt and just trying to get into a lot of action to see a lot of bucks, over your years of experience, is there any type of terrain as far as vegetation that you would say, if you could stick in this vegetation, you're going to have a lot of chances to see deer and see bucks? Is there any sort of vegetation or contour or, type of country that you would say, if you just want to go on your first Coues deer hunt, you want to get into a lot of bucks, a lot of action, this is what you need to look for?
Well, I would say that if you're going on your first Coues deer hunt and you want to see a lot of bucks, I would probably stay out of the low country.
Meaning the desert flats and the Ocotillos?
Yeah, exactly. Now, you can still get those Ocotillos and prickly pears and stuff like that, mesquite trees up in the mountains of the southern Arizona units, and so you can still get into quite a few bucks and stuff like that. But when I'm talking low country, when you start getting into those mesquite flats and rolling hills and whatnot, it just becomes real difficult. Number one, to find them because there's almost no vantage points out there. But I would tend to say that if you're looking to have a good, successful first Coues deer hunt, and you want to make sure that you're in the right terrain or vegetation and whatnot to get into, where you'll have the most opportunity at bucks, you just got to get up higher, and you got to get up higher than some of the other guys are willing to go. So get away from the road.
Do you mean hiking deeper? Is that what you mean? Like getting higher, getting deeper, getting further in?
Exactly.
Okay. And then do you look for like isolated points, like cone knobs, or are you looking for like a ridge line? When you're looking both, physically in the field and on your topo, are you looking for just isolated knobs, or are you looking for like big long ridge lines that you can get up on certain little rock outcroppings and be able to look off both sides? Like, I'm trying to pick into your brain of like what you're looking for. Let's say you're going into a new unit, which you've been in all those units down there, but let's just say you're going into a new unit. Are you looking and seeing a juicy long ridge that's like 3 or 4 miles long, and it just keeps getting taller and taller and taller, and but it's a predominant spine? Or are you looking at some cone type yellow peak, yellow grass on one side and thick oaks or thick trees on the north facing slope, and that's where you want to get up on?
Yeah, if I'm looking for the most ideal spot to glass from in an area that I've never been to, I'm probably going to gravitate towards the cone type knob or hill that I can have a good 360 view without having to move around too much. That's for sure. Sometimes when you get up on those ridge lines, you become a little bit limited because you're only glassing in front of you and behind you. When you're up on a cone knob or tall peak or something like that, you can get kind of a 360 view all the way around you. But I'll tell you, Jay, I found really big bucks from obvious spots, but that oftentimes isn't where I end up opening morning to try to hunt them. And that's generally because I found what may be not the most ideal spot to glass from, but it is the most ideal spot to glass from for that specific deer. So I could easily move by the time the hunt starts or whatever to give myself a little bit different of a view down inside where he lives. That's going to give me a lot better information than if I were to be way up higher or have a view of a lot more country. My view might be smaller, my field of view in what I'm trying to look for, but I'm getting a lot better information than I was back where I originally found him.
You keep talking about information, and what I gather from that is you're processing all of the things that are happening that you're seeing through the binos. You're constantly keeping track of the information and like data processing almost. And I'm reading into this that by the time the season starts, you've done enough looking from here and there and wherever that you have a pretty good sense of, okay, I've watched this buck now from 3 miles away all summer, but I'm going to be on that knob at daylight, or the night before, and I'm going to be right in there in that buck's kitchen. And I would also assume that there's some deer that maybe you still stay back, maybe until you watch them, maybe you feel like you can see them better. I want to pick into kind of your strategy of, do you stay back or do you get in there tight, and at what point do you decide to, okay, now's the time to get tight on that deer?
Yeah, Jay, I found that for me personally, that 1,000-yard range is generally about as, I might get a little bit closer, but anywhere from 800 to 1,000 yards is generally about as close as I want to get to a really big deer. I don't know what it is.
Why?
I feel like
Why?
I feel like that deer has lived his life and evaded as many predators as you can throw at that deer, and I feel like that's sort of the comfort zone that I have when I'm trying to spend a lot of time with that deer. There's now certainly when I'm hunting, I have no problem sneaking in closer and trying to make it happen with that. But that 800 to 1,000 yard range is like the perfect range that I get where I can break him down and I can tell you what he's going to score and stuff with the 15 power binoculars, and it'll work perfect within that range. And I don't feel like I'm bumping him or getting within too close of his core living room in his kitchen, like you'd call it.
I think that's a huge point. I mean, Dar and I always talk about, never get inside of 300 yards of a deer you want to kill. And that's speaking specifically like when we're on a stalk trying to kill a buck, we're looking for a vantage point, a sniper position, where we could get 300 yards or further from the deer, where we can make an accurate shot, where we have a good assessment of the area where the buck is. If we were to miss our first shot, maybe a rock knob or something where we have good vantage over the deer, try and put the shooter in that type of position. But what I also hear you saying is, that 800 to 1,000 yards, one thing I think about that is at 1,000 yards, you have a nice buffer there where most of the time that deer is not going to sense that you're there. I totally agree with you in the fact that you start getting in that even 500-600, 500-600 yards, and you clank a tripod leg, or I've seen deer just, at 1,000 yards, you can get away with a lot. At 500 yards, you can get away with way less, and certainly at 300 yards, you can't get away with anything.
Sure. I don't know how many times, Jay, I've been archery hunting, and I feel like I can get within 100 yards of all these deer all day long, but I can't get any closer to that. But when I got a rifle in my hand, I can't get anywhere closer than 400 yards. I just don't get it.
I totally know what you're saying. I think some of that maybe has to do with you just buckle down and make yourself get in that 100 yards. But if you're anything like we are, I mean, when you start getting, under 400, I feel like every step that I take that I'm just like, oh gosh, he's going to hear me. He's going to, and you're,
sure.
Say you get in at 350 and you're trying to get your pack set up. Like, I feel like every little zipper move, anything you do, that deer's going to sense you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always felt like, Jay, if you're not seeing very many deer, you're just moving too much. And you've got to just hold still. You've got to make your movement slow. And when it comes to these big animals, if you don't think they can pick up movement or sounds at 500-600 yards, then you're going to learn really fast that that's not the case. And these, especially when we're talking about big bucks, they live in places where sometimes it's going to be a 1,000-yard shot or it's going to be a 300-yard shot, and there's no in between. So if you can if you've got enough terrain or vegetation to work with, sometimes you can sneak within 300 yards and that buck would have no idea that you're there. But other times you might not have that buffer. And so hopefully you're a really good shot from a long distance, or you've got to almost turn it into a little bit of a miniature archery hunt where you're a lot more patient. You're using the vegetation and the terrain to your advantage and trying to get to that spot that ultimately you're in his kitchen. And if you're making too much noise or you're moving around way too much, he's gonna figure you out. And I hope you're quick on the trigger when he does.
I, I I've told guys that I've hunted with before, and they look at me like, a lot of times they look at me like I'm absolutely out of my mind nuts, and I say, listen,
Yeah.
we're gonna go stalk in on this deer, and I want you to pretend that if that deer hears you or senses you, you pretend that he's got a gun too and he can shoot you. And they look at me like, huh? And I say, you gotta be a predator. Like, you don't want them knowing you're there, and act like if that you have to be so sneaky and so secretive so that you don't get shot. And they're like, you want me to start acting like that deer's gonna shoot back? I'm like, exactly. And once I say that, then they realize, oh, okay, I get it. Like, if that deer
Yeah.
could shoot back, I would stay on the back side of the ridge. I would never even expose myself. I've seen so many people like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go shoot that deer, and they just go walking right down off, totally exposed. And it's like, okay, let's pretend that deer could shoot at 1,000 yards. Would you do that? No. Okay, then get on the back side of the ridge, or don't skyline over, creep over, keep brush behind you. There's so many things that, and some of the guys that I've hunted with that have military backgrounds and, law enforcement backgrounds, snipers and such, they get it. They get the fact that,
Yeah.
you don't put yourself out there exposed at all ever, and you don't want your quote unquote enemy or your quarry knowing you're even in the country until you're ready to pull the trigger. And if you can go about hunting Coues deer with that much attention to detail and stealth, I think, and I'm curious your thoughts, I think your level of success goes way up.
Well, and I think that's what it is, Jen. If you look back at all the people that you maybe grew up looking up to that were hunting here in the Southwest, and you started to slowly recognize those people who were really successful, and then you ultimately see their tactics and their methods and what they're doing in the field, and it's not slamming doors when they're getting out of the truck.
Ever.
It's not walking exactly ever. And no matter how many times you tell them to stop slamming the door, they still slam the door. But,
right.
Just see what works. And I think for me, what has generally worked, just like you were saying, you imagine that deer is hunting you. I tend to tell people, hey, if you're not sure what to do, hold still. And if you're not sure what to say, don't say anything, right?
Yeah.
So just keep quiet, hold still, and then just follow my lead. Do what I'm doing, and then, yeah, I get it. We're going to look funny to some hunter that's watching us sneak in on a buck, and we're still 800 yards away, and we're belly crawling. I understand that, but this is just generally what works.
Yeah.
And so you got to go with it. And so, some people have their own methods, and they work too, and I get that, and I understand it, but I've been fortunate enough, and Mark, my hunting buddy, is one of the best whitetail hunters I know, and I've learned a ton from him also. And we're learning from each other every year, and we've found exactly what works, and it certainly isn't being complacent on the hillside. Well, for me personally, I'm generally in an area that I'm either looking for a specific buck from the year before, or I'm looking in some country that seems to produce mature bucks altogether. I would say the least amount of my scouting is done in June, because I feel like it's, number one, way too hot. Number two, it's kind of the most unproductive. If you've got the time, I guess, getting familiar with the roads and different things like that, it would certainly benefit you. I feel like I have a pretty good idea where I at least want to start year after year. Down here in southern Arizona anyway, no matter which unit I'm drawing. But I would say that things start getting a little bit more serious for me anyway when it gets closer to August. I feel like I've got a better idea on what these bucks are going to become by the end of July, at least down here in southern Arizona. The weather's actually a little bit better too. You start getting into the monsoons, so the temperatures are more bearable you're talking about getting out there and either glassing, hiking around, checking trail cameras, whatever it is. It's a little bit more tolerant anyway. In later July and first part of August and stuff like that. But that's kind of how I do it, and I'll continue to do that through August and even into September, and just try to keep tabs on the specific deer that I'm following. Most of the time, that time of year, they're all going to be in bachelor herds. They're not going to be by themselves. Once in a great while, though, you can find a real big buck that might be by himself. He's just old, and I don't know, he feels a little bit more comfortable that way anyway. But generally, the bigger bucks are going to be bachelored together, and maybe the smaller bucks will be bachelored together also. But rarely do you see real small bucks hanging out with a real big buck or vice versa.
So we're July 19th right now. I would ask you, because I'm sure there's people listening that have trail cameras running, maybe they're new to it. Where are your mature bucks right now as far as growth? I mean, are they out to their G3s? You know, are they taking shape? I know every buck is kind of a little bit different. I know Coues Deer kind of mature at different rates, but kind of.
Well, I think you can tell they're mature, and oftentimes you can tell they're mature just by their sheer body size. Usually you have to reference them to another buck that's standing next to them or whatever. But, sometimes in these early season, summertime, their coats and everything like that, they look all thin and their necks are skinny. And so everything has a tendency to relatively look smaller than they do in December and January and stuff. But for the most part, you got to have something to reference them with. But these mature bucks, I would say, in my experience, you can get them they start getting into their G3s. You got good eye guards, and you can tell their G2s are looking really good, and they might be real balled up at the top, and see that they've still got quite a bit of growing to do. But you'll start getting into the G3s this time of year. But like you said, everything kind of grows a little bit different. You might have one that grows a little bit slower than the other. I had a buck that I killed a couple of years ago. He was, for example, he grew much faster than all the other bucks around there, and even the buck that he was hanging out with, ended up being about a 100-inch buck. He even rubbed his velvet 3.5 weeks later than the big buck that he was hanging out with that I shot. So it's kind of interesting how they all work like that.
Sorry to cut you off, but the big buck grew up real fast, and then the 100-incher rubbed his velvet, and then the big giant didn't even rub for another three weeks later. Is that what you meant?
No. The smaller buck rubbed later,
okay.
Like 3.5 weeks after the big buck did, and you could tell right away. It seemed like to me that their growth was relatively the same, given one was 120 inches and the other one was 100 inches, but the one rubbed his velvet 3.5 weeks later.
Gotcha.
It was just kind of interesting. But as far as the growth goes, you could obviously tell the 120-inch deer was going to be bigger than the 100-inch deer. That seemed apparent from the third week in July. But as everything progressed, that 120-inch deer just kept putting on more and more inches so much faster than the other deer.
Don't you think, being the 19th of July, don't you think the next, say, 30 days, that's when you can have deer that on trail camera or that you're looking at look, pretty same class, and then that buck that you're obviously, 120, 130 type, 140 type class deer, that's where in the next 2 weeks to say 30 days, when they just blow up.
Absolutely. I always think it's funny when guys get on social media the first couple of weeks in August and they keep talking about, oh man, the deer are behind this year. I don't know what they're going to do, and this buck seems really small. What do you guys think? And well, in my opinion, you got a 1 or 2 year old deer. That's what you're looking at. So
Yeah.
naturally, he's just going to be small. We just have to remember that through August, that's when they're going to do the majority of that's when they're going to have the majority of their growth. And so you just got to be patient. I mean, these bucks, they have their cycle and everything generally remains the same year after year. And so you just got to be patient and understand that they put on so many inches so fast that we tend to forget exactly how fast that is. And usually it's the first couple of weeks in August when people start getting frustrated, but by the first week in September, everybody's happy again.
For those listeners out there that don't know, typically a big mature buck is done growing when, and he rubs when?
I would say typically I would say a big buck is done growing the third week in September.
And
I would say they're already. I would say they're already rubbing their antlers shortly after that. Third, fourth. Right towards the end of September, they're already rubbing. This is down here in southern Arizona too, so
Sure.
Things might change by a couple of weeks up in northern Arizona. But in general, I'd say a big buck is done growing by the middle towards the end of September.
Okay, so in other words, between now, your big bucks that you're watching now, being third week in July, you're being patient because they still have a long ways to go.
For sure. And Jay, I used to spend a lot of time out there in July and even the first part of August. I probably don't spend as much time as I used to for various reasons, but for the most part because it never made a difference.
Right.
And ultimately, my time is valuable to me, and I would rather see how these deer are hitting the middle of their growth and as opposed to the beginning of their growth, because that's going to give me a lot better information than if I were to start burning all my vacation time now instead of later.
I think that's a huge point. Like, let them grow up, get them where when you look at them, you're like, okay, they're pretty much grown. This is a buck I want to focus on, rather than spending too much time. And I think people do this a lot with elk too. It's like they spend so much time in early season velvet when they're just growing and what have you, like, and then by the time the hunt comes, or when they should actually be really scouting, they don't have any more vacation and they're hosed. And I've seen it over and over and over, so I think that's a good point. I want to finish by asking you about bucks, and one thing, darn, I hunt a lot in Mexico, and we'll have a buck that's say 105 inches, and we're just like, nope, let's not shoot him, and let's let him grow. And then we come the very next year, and it's the same deer on the same hill in the same place, and he's the same 105 inches. Can you speak to your level of experience watching deer and getting frustrated at, it's a 108-inch buck, while some may say that's a phenomenal buck, and yes, it is. But when you want them to get to that 115, that 118, that 122, like to blow up, do you get frustrated a lot watching deer that you think are going to blow up, and then they're the same year after year after year?
Sure. I mean, I think that I have tendencies to believe that every relatively young-looking 100-inch deer is automatically going to be a 120-inch deer. I just got to let them grow for a few more years. we all love to dream like that. I think some deer just don't have the genetics. That's ultimately what it is in the end. He might have the age, and he may have had the moisture and everything that he needed where he lives, but he just topped out. It's just, in my experience, that's exactly what you're dealing with. I do feel like, though, because of moisture and feed, you can get some fluctuation with that, and so you might have a deer that is a 100-inch deer, and then maybe the next year he might even be a little bit smaller, and you do have to consider certain things, and that might be the amount of moisture, the amount of feed that he had, or the type of feed that he had that year.
Like, have you given up on deer in that situation, and then all of a sudden 3 years later you're like, there he is again, and he's blown up? Like, you gave up on him.
Yeah. Well, and maybe not necessarily given up, but I could tell you that Mark and I have been blown away at what certain deer have done, and it's because maybe we watched them as a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they're not really making a lot of progress, and maybe they're a deer that doesn't look like they have the potential, but then all of a sudden it just happened, and it's hard to explain. I don't know if anybody could have said that deer has the potential of being a 120-inch deer, but and that's why I think it's important also to, you tend to hang out in these areas that produce these mature bucks, and it's kind of cool because you keep tabs on these bucks and you see how they grow year to year, and you can't give up on them per se. So, if you can watch a deer for 2, 3, and 4 years at a time, and if he becomes stagnant for a couple of years in a row, he probably reached his max, reached his prime. But you can't quite give up on a deer because the very next year he's just as big, or maybe a little bit bigger, or maybe even a little bit smaller. I think you got to give him a couple of years before you totally give up on him.
If you had to pin down and say, most, let's say 120-inch bucks are X years old, what would your age, like, what do you want your bucks, like, if it was a perfect world and you could throw a circle, a bubble around some of the deer you're watching, what age would you say, I want that deer to get to this age, and that's where he'll be at his prime?
I'd say 6.
If they can get to 6, they're going to have a good chance to be a big, mature, big rack deer.
Exactly. If they've got those genetics, I would say they've got to reach that. Every deer is different, but if I'm going to throw a bubble around it, I'm going to say 6, maybe 5, but 5 or 6.
And would you agree or disagree that some deer never even will be 100 inches? I don't care if they're 8 years old, they will never make 100 inches.
Absolutely. It's funny. I helped a guy shoot a whitetail last year up in Unit 23, and when I saw this deer, he had a huge body on him, but he had the smallest kind of dwarf, funky, palmated little 3-point antlers on him, and this was his first Coues deer, and he didn't care. He was just so excited. He shot this deer, and we got up to this deer, and he was blind in one eye. He smelled like he was in full rut, and this was an early November hunt. He was just an old, nasty old Coues deer, but I'll bet the deer didn't score more than 60 inches. Yeah. So, anyway, we aged his teeth as best as we could without being experts at it or whatever. He was probably 9 to 10 years old.
Wow.
And so I don't know. Now that deer, no doubt, was regressing, but I would put a lot of money on the fact that deer was probably never a 100-inch deer to begin with.
Right. Right. And the anomaly deer, or that deer that you and your hunting partner are, looking for. I mean, you guys are looking for 120 plus. I would bet. They're not around everywhere. Speak to that a little bit. I mean, the 120-inch plus deer is hard to find.
Well, no doubt. No doubt they're hard to find. I didn't have, I killed a 120-inch deer 2.5 years ago, but I didn't have a 120-inch deer the past 2 years. So yeah, everything changes. I don't.
And
Maybe
you're
I'm just
working your
not as good
brains
as
out to
some of those
try and
other
find
guys.
them. But I mean, you've gone 2 years and haven't found your hunting partner shot a giant, but they're not everywhere, and you guys are working it over pretty dang good. It's just funny how there's a perception that I'm not going to say that there's not giant bucks in every unit, because there is, but they're
Uh-huh.
not around every tree. Just like there's not a 400-inch bull in Arizona around every tree. They're hard to find.
For sure. And I think ultimately in the end is what, and you see it probably more with elk hunters, Jay, than I do with Coues deer hunters, but any giant 6-point bull is automatically 400 inches.
Yeah.
And so
he's got big back, so he's at least 390.
Yeah, for sure. So you get guys that might see a really big Coues deer. Well, he's automatically 120 now. So, it takes a lot of time and really, I guess, and I'm not perfect at it, but, I have a little system in breaking a deer down and what I feel like he's going to score in the end. And it seems to work for me for the most part. So you got to really consider all the factors. When you're talking about a bull elk, you got to consider the fronts just as much as you got to consider the how he finished out and different things like that. So, same thing on a Coues deer. And, I think a lot of guys, they see these. It's funny. You can take my buck that I killed 3 years ago and put him, and that buck scored 120 and some change. And then you put him right next to Mark Hardy's buck that he killed last year. And if you had to choose, you had 5 seconds to take your pick, you better hurry and shoot one. You might actually shoot my deer.
Because of big frame.
Because he's got such a big frame.
Right.
So he'll kind of throw you off a little bit. And I think that's generally what you get when you get some of these guys in the field that they get a little bit caught up in he was really wide, or he was really heavy, or he was really tall. Ultimately, in the end, it takes
everything.
It takes so many things in order to reach 120 inches, and it just doesn't happen very often.
What would you say? Well, if you had to put your finger on the number one biggest characteristic for big Coues deer, big Coues deer, what's the number one characteristic that you want?
He's got to have length.
Yeah, length is everything, is it not?
Length, yeah.
Number of points and length. Yeah, point length is everything on Coues deer. Spread, it doesn't matter really how wide they are. Point length is everything.
No.
If they're 4x4 and they're long points, even better. Like 3x3, 8-inch G2s, 9-inch G2s, 7, 8-inch G3s. Like, they have to have big, long eye guards. Like, in order to be big, you've got to have point length.
Exactly. And that's why I think you really got to pick these deer apart, and you got to consider everything. I know in the last podcast we talked a little bit about a buck that Mark killed 2 years ago. He was a typical 4x4, and he netted 119 and some change. He netted almost 120, and ultimately, when you look at that deer and you set him next to a buck that might have just a huge frame, really tall tines, every day, out of the week, you'd shoot the buck that had a big frame and tall tines, when in the end, all of those 4 points on that buck on each side just added up.
Yeah, point length is everything.
Length is everything. Once in a great while, it's really neat. Mark and I have this discussion often. The biggest thing that can throw us off sometimes is mass. And that doesn't mean he's going to take him from a 110-inch deer to a 120-inch deer, but sometimes he can take him to the next class where he surprises you a little bit.
Mass hides length, always. Mass, heavy bucks, heavy bulls, they hide length. And if you're dealing with a buck that's got a lot of mass, you think his points are shorter, but when you get up to him, you're like, oh gosh, he's got 16
Hmm.
inches of mass, or 18 inches of mass. He's a giant, massive buck.
Yep.
And you're used to pinning in 14 inches of mass. Well, shoot, you get 18 inches of mass. You're talking 8 total inches right there, and you go from a 112 to a 120 like that.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you, Gray, that's where Mark and I underscored the buck that he killed last year. And I think ultimately in the end, mass hid a lot of length that he had. And so basically what happened was he went from a low 120s deer to a 130-inch deer. So, yeah, mass hides length for sure.
For sure, man. Well, I know you're busy. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you, giving us some of your knowledge, and I really encourage the listeners to find you on Instagram and follow you, and I encourage the listeners for sure to go back and listen to the episode that Jake and I already did. Jake's Instagram handle is Coues OCD, which is just a perfect handle. Coues OCD, so COUES OCD on Instagram. And Jake, I wish you the best of success this season. I forget, do you have elk, or did you draw any antelope or anything else before your Coues deer hunts?
No, all I've got is a deer tag this year. So
Okay. Well, you can
I'm not
focus on
lucky
that
like
then.
some guys. Yeah, that's all I've got.
Well, that's a good thing to have. I really appreciate you coming on. Look forward to having you on again, and wish you and your hunting partners the best of success. And yeah, we'll have to talk before the big game, and put a lunch or dinner wager on it or something, and have some fun with that. Okay.
For sure, Jay. Thank you for having me.
All right, buddy. You take care. Okay. God bless.
All right. We'll see you. You too.
Bye. Bye.